Hello everyone, this is Dr. Rodney Thomas, and today we're going to talk about one of the very first supply chain strategies that focuses on efficiency. In many ways, this strategy has existed for over a century. So what is an efficient supply chain strategy? Quite simply, efficient supply chain strategy with an intense focus on driving down costs across all supply chain processes and functional areas. Its goal is to supply products with predictable demand at the lowest possible cost. Unlike many strategic trends that come and go every few years, efficient supply chain strategy is an oldie but goodie that still exists today in many organizations. Under the right conditions, this strategy is very viable and clearly supports the generic corporate strategy of cost leadership. The goal of being more efficient has always existed in operating environments, but Henry Ford really brought the concept into the mainstream with his disciplined and scientific approach to mass production. Ford had the goal of making cars affordable for the average working family. He accomplished this goal by producing large quantities of vehicles that leveraged economies of scale and drove down unit costs throughout his factories and extended supply chains. To further explore this strategy, let's look at a basic rudimentary supply chain model. In reality, we know modern supply chains are complex webs with multiple tiers of suppliers and customers. But for simplicity's sake, let's focus on a more basic supply chain structure. It starts with raw materials from a supplier that are transported to an inbound distribution center. And that distribution center feeds a manufacturing facility as their production schedule dictates. Once finished goods are produced, they move through an outbound distribution center and are transported to a wholesaler or a retailer for ultimate sale to a consumer. These core functions and processes are common to most supply chains. The core functions and processes exist and must be performed regardless of what supply chain strategy we use. However, with an efficient supply chain strategy, every one of these functional areas has an intense focus on driving down the cost per unit. That typically means that sourcing will select low-cost suppliers and negotiate further large volume discounts for buying in bulk or committing to longer-term contractual arrangements with higher volume commitments. Likewise, inbound transportation will focus on selecting carriers that provide the lowest cost per mile rate and then further reduce transportation costs by only sending full shipments. The inbound distribution center will drive down distribution costs by receiving these full rather than partial shipments on lower line purchase orders that likely arrive in full pallet or full case quantities, and that makes receiving much more efficient. In the manufacturing facility, production schedules will be planned and optimized with nice long runs of a single item that reduces the production cost per unit and minimizes changeover costs. The outbound distribution centers will move large, efficient volumes of finished goods through the DC, perhaps even further reducing costs with cross-docking capabilities onto full outbound shipments to retail locations. This is what an efficient supply chain would look like. But why would you, as a supply chain manager, want to use this type of approach? Quite simply, because an efficient supply chain strategy drives the types and consistent coordinated actions across functional areas that create a strategic fit, which ultimately helps firm achieve its goal of being a low or lower cost provider. By being increasingly efficient, supply chain managers can drive down costs and ensure appropriate alignment with an overall cost leadership strategy. Having that type of strategic alignment is one of the most critical success factors for any firm to successfully compete in the marketplace. This all sounds good, right? So should we always use an efficient supply chain strategy? And the answer is no. There are certain conditions that create the best opportunity to use this approach. Let's take a look at the best conditions for an efficient supply chain strategy now. The first set of conditions comes down to market characteristics. Efficient supply chain strategy tends to work best with products that have long product life cycles, with steady and predictable demand, perhaps with longer lead times and limited product variety. These enable supply chain managers to efficiently plan and optimize sourcing, production, transportation, and distribution trade-off decisions. Products that work well with this type of strategy are often lower margin functional items that cannot bear the higher cost associated with premium services. Some examples might be agricultural items and commodity chemicals. Now, efficient supply chain strategy also works best when certain process characteristics are present. Efficient supply chains often require working with larger volumes that leverage economies of scale. Organizational facilities, processes, and capabilities all need to be able to handle these larger volume flows throughout a supply chain and throughout functional areas. Also, sourcing managers need to be willing and able to identify and select low-cost suppliers. This is why big box stores can leverage efficient supply chain strategy. Their immense purchasing power creates larger volume flows of goods that can drive prices down along the supply chain all the way to the end. Although there are a lot of good things associated with an efficient supply chain strategy, they come with some trade-offs. By moving large, efficient quantities through a supply chain in anticipation of ultimate consumer sales, you run the risk of having too much unsold or obsolete inventory near the end of the supply chain where inventory is most expensive to hold. This typically happens at retail locations and requires costly markdowns or write-offs to move through the inventory. Think about it for a minute. Markdowns aren't good if you are a retailer. So why are markdowns potentially occurring with an efficient supply chain strategy? Well, with this strategy, when does a customer actually buy the final finished good? In other words, when does the final consumer actually put cash into the supply chain? The answer is at the very end. Efficient supply chains push products into the market and incur all kinds of cost before the final consumer product is actually purchased. That can be risky. Firms run the risk of incurring costly, value-added supply chain services without ever selling a thing. That is the trade-off. And that is also why predictable demand is such an important market characteristic to consider prior to implementing an efficient supply chain strategy. But here's a teaser for you for our upcoming strategy discussions. I wonder what supply chain managers should do when demand is not as predictable.